Okay, welcome back to our talks. Just briefly for our speakers in this session, I just wanted to go over time really quick so y'all know what's happening. Our 2-minute card we will hold up when we have 13 minutes left. In the talk should be 15 minutes and then 0 minutes when you are out of time. So just look over here at us and we'll hold those up for y'all. Okay, so the first talk of this session will be by Zara, and she will be talking about wind tidal flats and cyanobacteria. Okay.
Thank you, Kelly. Good morning. Can y'all hear me okay? Great. Okay, so I'm Zara Hassan. I'm a master's student at the Heart Research Institute, and today I'll be talking about methods for cyanobacterial mat restoration on wind tidal flats in South Texas. So wind tidal flats are the dominant wetland type along the Texas Gulf Coast. You probably saw them when you were driving into TMSI this morning. And they're unique because they're irregularly inundated by wind-driven tides, making these systems highly dynamic. And these wind tidal flats are often characterized by conditions such as hypersalinity and intense solar radiation. And such extremes foster the growth of extensive cyanobacterial mats rather than typical marsh vegetation, as you can see in this photo here on the right. And these cyanobacterial mats are a critical link to higher trophic levels. While it may not look like it, they do support communities of benthic and fauna, making these habitats prime foraging ground for migratory birds that overwinter on the Texas coastline. Additionally, these mats are highly productive and drive many of the ecosystem services in these systems. When exposed, the mats look really dry and desiccated. However, when inundated, the cyanobacteria in these mats effectively reanimate. And this close-up photo of a submerged cyanobacterial mat with tons of oxygen bubbles really speaks to the photosynthetic potential of these systems and their productivity. But who's responsible for this productivity? So these mats, again, while it may not seem like it, they host a diverse community of microorganisms. Cyanobacterial mats are known to develop in many extreme environments around the world, but in South Texas, they are dominated by these filamentous nitrogen-fixing cyanobacteria that have a remarkable capacity to withstand a wide range of environmental conditions, making them the perfect candidate to thrive on wind tidal flats. These filaments form laminated structures within the sediment that bind grains and prevent erosion, which is especially important in systems that have little vegetation to buffer that strong wind influence. And then within this fabric of filaments, there are also coccoid cyanobacteria and diatoms that help contribute to this primary production, along with other microorganisms. However, most of the public perceives wind tidal flats as barren wastelands. And over half of the extent of wind tidal flats in Texas have been degraded by human activities. One example of this is vehicle damage. That's a pretty common occurrence on wind tidal flats. On the left-hand side is an inundated flat, and then on the right-hand side, you can see where once the tide has gone out, water is still retained within this tire track damage, causing something called channelization to occur. And this disrupts the unique surface hydrology of these systems, and this water retention can also affect the quality and develop of cyanobacterial mats on the wind tidal flats. And this is a problem because a damage like this can persist on the tidal flats for decades. And yet there are currently no established restoration techniques for these specialized systems. Therefore, the objective of my work is to develop a method for restoring cyanobacterial mat cover within these damaged wind tidal flat areas. I am doing this by conducting 2 pilot restoration experiments on a wind tidal flat at Newport Pass, and they are testing 2 different restoration treatments that I will detail a bit more here. So within each of our experiments, we have 3 passive restoration treatments. There's a control, a damage treatment, in which we compress the mat to a depth of 4 centimeters to mimic what a tire track disturbance would be like. And then a sand treatment, in which we fill this compressed area with loose wet sand to restore elevation within the plot to the surrounding flat. Within each experiment, these treatments are crossed with either lab-grown cyanobacterial cultures or a fertilizer treatment, as you can see in this randomized plot design here. And the idea with each of these treatments is that we want to facilitate the growth of those mat-forming filamentous cyanobacteria that I showed you earlier, with the idea that these are pioneer organisms that will help recruit the other important phototrophs that live on wind tidal flats to the sediment surface. And I hypothesize that addition of these active restoration treatments will facilitate quicker mat growth than the passive restoration treatments alone. Specifically, I chose a fertilizer that had a higher ratio of phosphate to nitrogen because previous studies have shown that greater levels of phosphate enrichment can promote cyanobacteria growth in intertidal microbial mats. My cyanobacteria culture treatment was a little bit more intensive, but essentially I isolated those filamentous cyanobacteria from mats that had been collected at our experiment site, and I grew them in some culture media for 3 months, after which point I began gradually exposing these cultures to greater salinities, temperatures, and irradiance to prepare them for the field. 6 months later, I prepared a suspension of these filaments that could be poured within the treatment area. As you can see in this photo here on the bottom right, this is a plot that was treated with sand and then seeded with additional cyanobacteria cultures. So I've been monitoring the performance of my treatments quarterly since June of 2024. And I do this 3 different ways: by measuring the development of cyanobacteria mat cover over the treatment areas, characterizing the community of phototrophs within the mat, and also measuring elevation change within the treatment area relative to the surrounding area. For the sake of time today, I'll only be focusing on these first 2 categories with preliminary data from the first 6 months of my cyanobacteria treated experiment only, because the results were pretty similar between that and my fertilizer treated experiment. So to quantify the development of cyanobacteria mat cover, I used the ImageJ software to trace areas of growth over our treatment plots. Here we have an example of a plot that was treated with sand only. And after 1 month, we saw only 6% of the mat was covered with cyanobacteria growth. After 3 months, this jumped all the way up to 96% cover. And while it may not look like it, 6 months later, this is a plot with 100% coverage of cyanobacterial mat. And I do validate the presence of mat using qualitative microscope observations. To give you an idea of what these data look like over time, I've plotted the mean percent mat cover on the y-axis. In the top row of plots are those passive restoration treatments alone, and in the bottom row are these same treatments, but they had been seeded with those additional active cyanobacteria treatments. And what we see is that over time, the percent cover of mat has almost entirely recovered for most of our treatments, with some variation in those damaged treatments that you can see in the middle there. But overall, this is very promising because this recovery occurred a lot quicker than I expected it to. It's also important for us to characterize the community of organisms throughout the duration of our experiment. One way that I do this is by collecting samples for high-performance liquid chromatography photopigment analysis, or HPLC. And I will collect samples for this from within each of my treatment plots. And what the HPLC data provides us with is a profile of photopigments and chlorophyll accessory pigments that can be used as a proxy for the community of phototrophs that are present within the surface of the mat. So we can take a look at some of this HPLC data from the first 6 months of my experiment here in this principal component analysis plot. And the different colored points indicate those passive restoration treatments, and the open shapes show the plots that had been seeded with those cyanobacteria cultures. Essentially, we do not see an obvious difference in the community structure of the mat between our treatment types. However, when we take this same plot and recolor the points based off the sampling date, we begin to see some interesting clusters emerge, especially along PC1, which explains 64% of the variation in our data. We begin to see this almost seasonal gradient occurring along this axis, which could potentially be explained by these vectors. So this is only a subset of the pigments that we get from our HPLC data set. But to orient you, fucoxanthin is a pigment that represents the presence of diatoms, and the remaining 4 pigments representative of cyanobacteria in the environment. And these are the predominant phototrophs that we see at our study site. With this additional context, we can see some potential temporal dynamics that are influencing the mat community structure, especially with that strong relationship between the diatom pigment in our samples collected in December of 2024. Additionally, this separation of points along PC1 could potentially be explained by the presence of those cyanobacterial pigments. And this temporal change in the mat community between May and December of 2024 is also visually apparent, as you can see in these photos here. So in May, the mat has this dark, leathery appearance that's pretty characteristic of cyanobacteria mats in this area. But in December, this same plot is covered with this light brown diatomaceous biofilm. And there's a couple of reasons why this may have occurred and why we're seeing this visual change. In the wintertime, we generally see an increased frequency and duration of inundation events, which can drop the salinity on the wind tidal flats and create more favorable conditions for diatoms to proliferate. Additionally, it looks like there's been fresh deposition of sediment over the mat area, providing sandy substrate for these smaller organisms to colonize. So again, while we're not seeing an obvious treatment effect within our experimental site on the mat community structure, there's some clear seasonal pattern that is beginning to emerge in our data. And this is still important to understand because that is a major gap in the literature. Wind tidal flats are very understudied systems, and there is little published about the seasonal dynamics of cyanobacteria mats within wind tidal flats specifically. And if we can understand the seasonal succession that's occurring on these systems, it can also inform us as to how these mats can naturally recover from disturbances, which still has interesting implications for our restoration work. However, these analyses are ongoing, and there are still many factors that I need to consider within my data, as are my experiments. So I'll continue monitoring my restoration experiments until June of this year. And in the meantime, I have been working to develop scalable methods for cultivating cyanobacterial mat in mesocosms with the idea that this will provide land managers with a more cost-effective way to restore cyanobacterial mat coverage should this be seen as a viable option for restoration. Additionally, this work can provide managers with practical methods for monitoring those restoration outcomes. Wind tidal flats are very understudied and definitely underappreciated ecosystems, so I'm very grateful to be conducting this work and demystifying cyanobacteria mats here in South Texas. And I have my funding sources to thank for that with the Restore Council and the National Park Service for making this work possible. And I can take any questions now. Oh,
Yeah, we have plenty of
great.
time for questions.
Yes. Ooh, that's a really good question. I think it's very context dependent. So a wind tidal flat that has greater sediment accretion rates might be able to recover quicker. I would say that any damages that occur within those dry seasons when sediment's not accreting or they're not receiving as much rainfall or tidal influence to promote the cyanobacteria growth or productivity, in those seasons, they might be more susceptible to damage just because of those external environmental factors that influence like mat accretion and development over time. Any other questions? Yes. That's a rich text. Basically, it's pretty difficult, at least, to cultivate these mat-forming organisms, or at least in my experience, for this restoration purpose. So whatever method that I use following sterile technique and conventional algae culturing techniques was not well suited for scaling up the production of biomass because they form this biofilm layer around them, like the filaments, and they stick together and they don't really like to be like within a culture plate or flasks, for example. But with this scalable cultivation method, I found that they really like to grow over substrate. So the presence of sand and sediment in these mesocosms, it makes it so easy for the mat to form that vertical profile that we see out in the field, which is really cool. So yeah, that's an active experiment we're still working on, but yes. Oh, yes. Thank you. Mhm. That is not something that I'm looking at in my experiment, although it is, I think, would be an interesting direction for future work if the fertilizer treatment is something that the land managers and stakeholders would be interested in scaling up. Because yeah, I'm not entirely sure what the implications would be for like scalable application of the fertilizer over a large area and how that might affect the system. But we applied a very small amount within our treatment plots. So I'm hoping that the influence on the overall system would be negligible. But yes. Anybody else? Yes.
You know, the dip, but you also have a compression and decrease in porosity. Is there any, you know anything about whether the porosity matters in terms of the filaments getting through the sediment? Like, is that the cyanobacteria care on that, or?
So there's actually a second component of my project where I'm characterizing the mat within damaged and undamaged areas over a larger scale. And so basically that work is in progress. And I can get back to you if I am seeing significant changes in the cyanobacteria community within those damaged and undamaged areas. So, yes. Okay, thank you.
Right. Oh, yeah. Awesome. Okay, our next speaker is Kathy Sweezy, and she'll be talking about the restoration of oyster reefs.
Thank you.
Yeah. Lasers at the top.
Okay. How's everyone doing? See lots of thumbs up, lots of really tired people. I might be in that tired people bucket. But hopefully I'll get you pumped up a little bit more. So my presentation is going to be a little bit different than probably most of the presentations you've heard so far. Also, I hear a little bit of an echo, so that might get to me. But for those of you who don't know me, my name is Kathy Sweezy. I'm a coastal restoration project manager with the Nature Conservancy. Today I'm going to be talking about restoring oyster reefs through diverse partnerships. And this is something that is really close to my heart. This is something very near and dear because I always say that we can't get our work done alone. We have a lot of great partners in this room, so really quick, raise your hand if you worked with the Nature Conservancy before. I see lots of hands up. I also see lots of hands down. I don't like that. I need to change that by the end of this presentation. So let's get started. Just to set the base for everybody, I really want to focus on what the Nature Conservancy is really focusing on, specifically in the Gulf of Mexico. So the Nature Conservancy released this document in October of 2023. These are recommendations for oyster restoration in the Gulf of Mexico. There are 9 focal strategies within this document, but really in this presentation, I'm going to focus on 3. So first is managing oyster populations based on the multiple benefits of oysters. Next is instituting shell retention programs and identifying alternative substrate materials. And third is using new techniques to increase the scale and pace of oyster reef restoration. That's a mouthful. But I want all of you to look at these, keep these in your mind, because you're going to see these themes come throughout our presentation. And this again goes into why we can't do this alone. So for those of you who also don't know me very well, I work on all the oyster reef restoration projects in Texas for the Nature Conservancy, and there is me. That's a lot of work to be done. Texas is very large. Our coast is very large. So when you look at these focal strategies that we have, I personally cannot do this alone. So definitely keep that in mind as we're going through. Again, for those of you who are not aware of what the Nature Conservancy has done so far for oyster reef restoration, we've restored 3 oyster reefs in Texas. They're all subtidal oyster reefs. Plus, we have 1 reef that we have supported as a very integral partner on. The first reef that we restored was Half Moon Reef in Matagorda Bay. Next was Lap Reef in Copano. And then the third was Beasley Reef in Galveston Bay. We also supported the Rhett Reef project, but I'm going to save that punchline for a little bit later on. We'll talk a little bit more through that project. But first, I want to go through Beasley Reef. This is going to be one of the 2 reefs I'll talk about today to really focus on why our partnerships matter. So Beasley Reef is the first non-harvestable and harvestable designed project in Galveston Bay. We're combining both of those aspects into one single project. This means there's an area of the reef that is protected as a sanctuary, and then there are areas of the reef that are designed with the intention of being commercially harvested. This looks at both that ecologic aspect, but also the economic aspect of oyster reef restoration and the benefits that come from that, which is all great. And I absolutely adore this project. If you want to learn more about it, talk to me afterwards. The thing I do want to focus on are all these names at the bottom. These are our great partners that we have for this project. Some of them are in this room right now. And I really want to point out why they are important. So first, starting with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. So Texas Parks and Wildlife is our monitoring partner for this project. I don't have a boat. They do. And they also are the ones who are monitoring oyster reefs across the state. So they know what they're doing. They are the experts for monitoring oyster reefs across the state, especially when we say that we have harvestable areas. So having them as a partner to help us monitor these oyster reefs has been very, very, very valuable. On top of that, another really important partner is Galveston Bay Foundation. So up here is Sally Clark, and she is one of our really important partners to help us with communicating our work to the local communities. The Nature Conservancy is a nonprofit that is internationally based. We have groups all over the world. And while we're really good at having these big scale projects, we're not as great about getting down into those community levels and really knowing those communities very well. We definitely have local experts, but there are even better experts than us. And that's where Galveston Bay Foundation has come in. So they've been able to provide that local on the ground knowledge of our communities and help us communicate out our projects more. Another partner we have are academic partners. So I know there's a lot of students that have given talks. So raise your hand if you're a student. Awesome, there's so many, I love this. Many of you, raise your hand if you gave a presentation and at the end of it you had those next steps. Right, so every single one I'm sure who raised their hand in the first place, raise their hand for the second one. You always think about what's next. What is my work going to be used for? Me. Your work is going to be used by me. And this is really important because I have a lot of questions to ask. I have a lot of things that I want to know about my projects that I can't answer myself. So who am I going to go to? The experts in the room who just raised their hands. The ones who really are digging into the science and are able to answer those very detailed questions about the work. Now, the last one here, this is a very unique partner as well for this project in particular. Who here likes to go like rod and reel fishing? Hopefully quite a few of us. This is a bays and estuaries meeting, so I'm assuming a lot of people here are fishers. So fishers are a great partner to have, even in an advisory role or as a stakeholder, because they have that knowledge on the water. They're the ones who know, oh, our fish that we used to catch 5 years ago, we're just not catching them as much anymore. Or maybe they used to be over there, but now they're over here. Or maybe, hey, we used to never see this, but now we're seeing this a lot. And that local ecological knowledge is so important to advise these projects and help you determine where should you actually place these. Another one just to quickly highlight too are media partners. I did mention about how Galveston Bay Foundation has helped us get the messaging for the local communities in the Galveston Bay area, but also having media partners in general is so important to get the word out to the public. If people don't know what you're doing, they're not going to care. But if you're able to educate them and tell them what's going on and why it matters to them, they're going to want to support you more. So just being able to talk to media, and I know, especially as scientists, we are generally a little bit more quieter and a little bit more introverted. I'm talking about myself right now, honestly. I'm hoping there's people who relate to that in the room. But breaking out of your shell and understanding that talking to media and talking to these groups are very important and can help you get that message across a little bit more clearly, can help you get that support. Now, before I switch over to the next part, as you're in these meetings and as you're networking and meeting all these really awesome people with these really awesome ideas, I also want you to listen to what's going on. So I'm going to take an example here from some working group meetings. Going back to Parks and Wildlife, they have these awesome oyster restoration working groups where a lot of commercial oyster fishers join. And these statements I'm about to show you are statements that I've actually physically heard from commercial oyster industry. Starting with, I don't understand why others are restoring non-harvestable oyster reefs. It takes so long for an oyster reef to be restored. Why do scientists need data when I can see what's happening right now? The permitting process is so confusing. And as you're hearing these statements and as you're talking with people, whether it be in this room or meetings you're going to be able to identify those or connect those dots and identify collaborative opportunities in ways that not only can they help you, but you could possibly help them too. And that's what we did in one of these meetings. We heard all of these statements, and then one of the statements in particular stood out to us. The permitting process is so confusing. I don't know how many people have done restoration projects before. That is the most true statement on this board. It is really confusing, it's very long, and it can be challenging if you've never done it before. But as the Nature Conservancy, we've had multiple large-scale projects, and we're comfortable with this process now. We understand how it works and what type of language should go into permit applications, that we said, hey, tell us more about this. And that's how we got to Rhett Reef. So Rhett Reef is the first non-harvestable, completely sanctuary oyster reef that was led by a member of the commercial fishing industry, commercial oyster fishing industry, excuse me. So Lisa Halili is pictured over here. She's part of Prestige Oysters and also has a nonprofit arm of that, San Leon Oyster Fest. So Lisa had this idea that she wanted to restore a sanctuary oyster reef, something that will not be harvested. And we said, that sounds like a great idea. I would love more sanctuary oysteries. That sounds fantastic. So we wanted to learn more about this project, and she was really struggling going through that permitting process. So what we said is like, well, why don't we help you? Well, we can guide this process a little bit. We can help you with some language. That's no problem at all for us. And as we start to learn more about the project, we build this relationship more. We learn about other opportunities that we can continue this partnership. So what we actually ended up doing is going to Texas Sea Grant and applied for funding to continue monitoring on this project. Not only do we just want monitoring in general for these reefs, but this one was very interesting. This is a way that we can kind of take a little sneak peek into that world of commercial oyster industry. We don't know how they restore reefs. We kind of do, but we don't have that data of how they restore reefs, and we don't have that data of how they're monitoring it. And this is just something that we really wanted to understand a bit better. So this is a great partnership and shows us how we can really get that on the ground work with unique partners. So pointing out again some of the unique partners on this project in particular, I already mentioned oyster industry. We also have additional on the ground oyster industry who helped with the restoration itself. They help with the monitoring. So they're the ones who take me out on the boat and help us see how the reef is doing. Pier 6 is in San Leon, Texas. They are the ones who provided all the oyster shell that was recycled and then placed back onto Rhett Reef to restore it. And then another really cool partner for this one are master naturalists. So are there master naturalists in this room? Awesome, me too. Master naturalists are awesome. They're such a great volunteer source, and they're an absolutely fantastic partner to have on projects that you just need some extra hands on. So master naturalists are a great way to get those extra hands, but also to get that word out to your local communities. So again, trying to get that word out, trying to get more support. If you couldn't tell from this whole presentation, this is really the one-liner I want everybody to take home with them. We cannot do this alone. This is really hard work. This is really hard work to do just as a single oyster person for TNC Texas. And we really can't do this alone. So I know a couple people are already pictured up here who are in this room. I see Bill up there. But a lot of these groups are very, very different. We have academia, we have state partners, we have nonprofits, we have oyster industry, we have people who just have a boat. It's a simple partner to have, but we need that. And so just thinking outside of the box is so important on any sort of project. So as students who are just getting started, your work is so valuable for us who are starting to restore these sites. For people like me who are restoring these sites, understanding that you can find knowledge anywhere you go. Everybody has something that they can contribute. Now, just to finish us off, I do have to shout out, we have some workshop series coming up later this summer, so in July and September. If anybody's interested in learning more or starting these relationships, the core workshops, this is the Collaborative Oyster Restoration and Evaluation workshops. These are really going to be a way that we are going to build those relationships with these very diverse, unique stakeholders and partners. So we're trying to bring oyster industry into the room. We want to bring the resource managers, TPWD, into the room. We want to bring other restoration folks into the room, engineers, anyone who has a stake in oyster reef restoration and just wants to learn of how can we collaborate a little bit better on these projects? How can we get these projects done? Because right now we are not restoring oysters to the state that they need to be in order to reach a sustainable level. And so we need more people doing this. And how can we get to that point? Well, thank you all so much. And I think I have 2 minutes for questions. I have 2 minutes for questions. Nothing? That's totally fine too. So he's asking about interest in oyster farming and working with, I'm assuming oyster, like mariculture? Yes, perfect. Yeah, no, we definitely are starting to work a little bit more closely with mariculture, especially with the work with Sea Grant. Sea Grant does a lot with mariculture, and so we are trying to lean a little bit more into that as well. We're very supportive of mariculture. It's fantastic that it's a growing area in the state, and definitely very supportive. If anybody's into mariculture in this room, please come talk to me afterwards. I'd love to meet you. Awesome. Thanks all.
Okay, our next talk is by Deborah, and she'll be talking to y'all about some native grasses.
Good afternoon. I'm going to just, okay, great. I'll start. So I'm Deborah January Beavers. I'm president of Houston Wilderness. By the name, we are officed in Houston, but our coverage area is much bigger, which I'm about to show you. And also, I'm so pleased that the organizers put all of these presentations together because they're all about scale. So I'm another scale that I'm going to talk about today. Our organization's 23 years old. We were founded with the idea that when there is a environmental need, that no particular nonprofit's mission is to work on that, or it needs to be collaborative in order to make it happen. When we can and our board approves it and there's funding available, we come in to help facilitate whatever that is. And sometimes we might be involved for 2-3 years, and sometimes we may be involved 10+ years. What I'm going to talk about today is a 10+ year involvement. So now 10 years ago, we created what at the time was 8-county Gulf Houston Regional Conservation Plan. The idea was that, and this 10 years ago, right? So, you know, that was before Harvey, before lots of stuff that has gone on in the last 10 years. And the governmental, nonprofit, and business community to some extent wanted to come together and say, what are the big, hairy, audacious goals we need to be working toward? And what they came up with was, and this, by the way, this we is a steering committee for the Regional Conservation Plan. 24% by 2040 in protected preserved land in the 8-county area, which is Harris and surrounding counties. 50% nature-based infrastructure of some kind, whether it's tree planting, native grass replacement of non-native, et cetera. Bioswales, coastal work. And then at the time, 0.4% increase in carbon sequestration. That was based on the Paris Agreement similar goal, and so we adopted it for our region. Several different municipalities and the counties have adopted this, or parts of this, in their own resiliency plans. So we've moved along with this and done a variety of things over the last decade, working with a whole slew of partners. I can't put them all up on one slide, it'd be too many. And I know there's some folks in here that we have worked with in a variety of ways. But after the decade, or what we're calling the first decade of this plan, there was a recognition that we needed to shift some of our focus more coastal. And that's what we've done. So we've expanded by, again, we, it's not just Houston Wilderness, we facilitate, but it's a big we of about a 30-member steering committee made up of federal, state, and local governmental agencies, as well as nonprofits and some businesses, actually, that are very interested in this issue, and academic researchers. So we have broadened it now. 24% by 2040 has stayed protected preserved land. That's mostly inland issues, although we're creating additional green space along the coast, which I'm going to talk about. Still, nature-based infrastructure by 2040, 50% generally of a coverage area having some type of nature-based infrastructure on it, again, native grasses, trees, that kind of thing. And then just an annual add of green and blue carbon sequestration. Actually trying to quantify that when you go beyond trees became kind of difficult. I don't have to tell you all this, but I like to show this slide when I give presentations. We get everything, right? So our resilience, when people say, how are you handling resiliency for drought? Well, we're doing this and that. How are you handling it for flooding? Blah, blah. I mean, we get it all. So we have to, pretty much all. So we have to deal with so many pieces of resiliency, which I know you all know. And the way that we're doing that, and again, big we, is through multiple lines of defense. And as I know this audience here would agree, we want as much of that to be nature-based, right, than gray, unless it has to be. And sometimes it does. But we want so much more nature-based infrastructure if we can, because we know all those ecosystem services that they provide. So we have some action items, and I know I kind of broke the PowerPoint rule of too much narrative, but had to get it on here. So this just gives you kind of a visual idea of some of the action items that we have as we are working to facilitate things that other folks just either needed a facilitator to do and help make happen, bringing groups together, and or kind of needed a way to wrap a program around an important need. So for instance, we've created an initiative called Targeted Use of Beneficial Use. Do most folks here know about the Corps of Engineers Beneficial Use projects? You're going to hear about it this afternoon, okay? But there is a speaker on it. But they have really ramped up, they being the Corps of Engineers, and their partners have, and with help from Texas GLO and Ducks Unlimited and others, they have really ramped up the use of beneficial use for all kind of creation of additional spaces for nature-based infrastructure along our coast, which is exciting. Yes, it's important for their work along the intercoastal waterway, but we all get to benefit from that by the way they're trying to ramp up nature-based infrastructure on those beneficial use areas. Now, so there's all kind of partners working with them on all the different projects. I'm going to show you a few of them. But the one thing that kept coming up over and over and over, which is how we got involved, Houston Wilderness, was when we start doing these gigantic projects, we don't have enough native grasses. We have fabulous organizations out there doing grasses, but we don't have anywhere near enough. And so what we did is we agreed to take on coordination of expansion of availability of multiple native grass farms for coastal, but as well as sort of slightly inland, estuarine and other inland areas. And it's called the Regional Access to Native Grasses Growers Group, or RANG, and it falls underneath, it's not the steering committee, we show up the Regional Conservation Steering Committee, but we now have this RANG group that's made up solely of grass growers or contractors. Some folks, like nonprofits, grow grasses and then contract to plant them. They're not a true grass grower in the sense that's not their main business. So some are private, for-profit businesses, some of them are nonprofits. But they're all included. We want to include it. We want everyone at the table to talk about how we do this giant ramping up of grass availability. And other vegetation, by the way, not just grasses, but mostly grasses. And then we are going to continue the research and analysis on the fact that our seagrasses are encroaching inland and creating a bit of a problem for areas that were not originally experiencing seagrasses as part of their ecology. And so part of what we're excited about doing is using these beneficial use and other projects as a way to replace those seagrasses and help them avoid encroachment. So that's very important. And then we apply a lot of research, which I'm going to do a little shout out in a minute. We apply a lot of the research and modeling that you all and others are doing in these areas, which are critical. We don't do anything that's not science-based. So this just gives you a little bit of an idea. I'm going to talk a little bit about this, although I know you're going to hear more about it this afternoon. This is just a big 50,000 feet level. Beneficial use of dredge material. Again, lots of projects going on all along the coast. And our RANG, our Regional Access to Native Grasses group, is made up of growers of grasses of all kinds that can potentially provide grasses for different coastal areas. So we've got some folks who are down south, and that's kind of their area. That's fine. We've got other folks who are, who are up by Galveston Bay or over even as far as Jefferson County. So that kind of gives you an idea of the amount of projects. These are QR codes for the dashboard. It's only about 3 months old now. It's super cool. You can go to the Beneficial Use Hub, or you can go to their other dashboard, and you can put in parameters of where you want to see what projects are going on where. It doesn't have all of them yet, but it does. While it has all the beneficial use projects, it has all the Texas GLO Resiliency Plan projects in it. They will eventually have Ducks Unlimited projects on there and others as they're adding them. So that's going to be a wonderful site, much needed, and the Corps of Engineers stepped up and made that happen. This is an example on that dashboard for Galveston Bay. The stars are Corps of Engineer projects. The buffaloes are Texas GLO Resiliency Plan projects. So again, you can see just here, and that's just these agencies, right? And the resiliency plan. It's not a whole lot of other projects going on. So that gives you the idea of scale of the need that we're going to have, and that we have now to be able to provide a variety of different grass species. This is West Galveston Bay Barrier Island. It's going to be finished by this summer and be in desperate need of grasses and other vegetation. And this kind of gives you an idea of what the Corps of Engineers is thinking on what type of grasses they're going to want in those areas, working with a variety of local partners to know that answer. This is Matagorda Bay area. And again, you could go on the site and look at it. I just want to give you all an idea of scope. Look at that, the East Matagorda Bay. I mean, that thing is huge. And 96 acres of upland availability of species and 250 acres of marsh. So we got to have the grasses to do that. And oysteries. Shout out for that. The RANG isn't working on that, but glad that Nature Conservancy and others are. And that's, it's critical. This is... so I wanted to show you here, because if you heard the talk yesterday on Boggy, that project's here. It's one of the buffaloes. You can see it kind of right there. So that's that project that you heard about yesterday going on. So again, it's all about coordination, working with a variety of different partners to make all this happen, so that we have significant increase in nature-based infrastructure. There's San Antonio Bay area, Corpus Christi Bay. Look at all those projects. This is, if you want to just see the Texas GLO Resiliency Plan projects and not the Corps, you can do that. You can see their dashboard of all their projects. Again, lots. Now these, I want to bear in mind, the beneficial use projects are all going to happen. That's not true necessarily of Texas GLO, but you're going to hear later from Joshua about how that project works. So these are a lot of projects. A lot will get, maybe they will all get funded and done, but not necessarily. And so I do want to point that out. But the BU projects are all online, all approved, and all expected to be implemented. Here is just an example of our Excel sheet of all our various RANG members. And you're going to see at the end, I'm going to mention that if you know a grower and you don't know if they're on the list and or you want to be involved in the Regional Conservation Plan coastal effort, I'd love to hear from you and see if whoever you know or you're involved with related to native grasses is on here. So we want to be as inclusive as possible. So I'm constantly saying, if you know of other growers or providers, suppliers, let me know. And then so they've met, this is all still fairly new. We've sort of been going on about 6 months. And so they have met virtually. And they're going to be meeting in person eventually, but those that want to on-site visits. But we have met a couple times now, and they are now all a part of this Google group. Google sheet, and this is just to show you what it kind of looks like. There's lots of sections, but we have divided up the species, by area. and they're going in now with the Google Sheet and letting us know a variety of things. Where, thank you. Where are they? Where do they have availability? Where are they planning that? You know, what's possible for them? What are their comments on those particular species? That kind of thing. That's going really well. We're very happy about that. This is my shout out. So I understand Barrett may be in this room. Is she? No? Okay, she must be in the other room. I heard she was here. Okay, well this, you'll see the resource over there. This just came out this year and we love this. Yay, this is wonderful data for us and for all our partners because it provides a distribution of Texas estuarine vegetation within various areas of all along the coast. We love this. And then also over here, your submerged aquatic vegetation, that's data on where that is. So you can see why that's helpful, right? As we're looking at these brand new areas where we've got to, you know, put all these different vegetative and grass species to know where things are now and what the distribution is and where the loss has been is very, very important. So we're super excited about that. This is just another kind of a chart showing that. So again, shout out and yay to researchers there and also all the things you all are doing. And this is a quick mention about blue carbon. We're not specifically quantifying blue carbon. I hope you guys are out there doing that. I know there was a little bit about it in the other session, I think, while I'm standing here. But we're aware of it and how important it is. And wow, imagine when you're putting these numbers of native grasses back in the ground and vegetation, what you're doing to increase blue carbon. So we're super excited about that. There's my last slide. We welcome regional, RCP steering committee members. If you're interested, there's my email address, and then that QR code will take you to our webpage on our regional conservation plan. Again, if you know of growers and you wonder if they're on the list, I'd love to hear from you to see if they are, make sure they get on that list. And then also, if you have researcher data resources, when you go to our webpage, there's I call it a 2-pager, because in public policy work, we love 2-pagers or 1-pagers, but it's really a 5-pager because there's 3 pages of resources. But I'd like, take a look at that. Thank you. And if you don't see something there you think should be there, or something maybe you're working on, I'd love to hear from you about that too. Okay, I've run out of time. Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. Okay, our last talk before lunch is by Matthew, and he will be talking about Rookery Islands in Texas.
All right, last one before lunch, so we'll try to make it quick. So I'm Matt Sadowski. I'm a EIT with HDR's Coastal Engineering team here in Corpus Christi. Joining me today is Rosario Martinez, a senior project manager with the Coastal Bend Bays and Estuaries program. And we'll be going through one of our recently completed Rookery Island protection projects at Triangle Tree, and then some upcoming future projects. So starting out with Triangle Tree. I guess for this group, I probably don't need to go too in-depth into Rookery Islands, but just to quickly touch on them, throughout the Texas bays, they were mainly created by dredge spoils from the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway, and then also oil and gas exploration. So the figure on screen shows the Upper Nueces, or Upper Laguna Madre Bay in the 1950s with some of the relatively new created islands. And what these islands do are provide vital habitat for wintering and migratory bird species that come through the area and these islands are away from any predators or human development. So it allows them a place to either stop and rest or to rear their young. However, over time, these islands have been disappearing by some of the factors listed on screen. And with that, these bird species are losing habitat that they are now relying on. So this project at Triangle Tree focused on Triangle Tree Island, which is located in the Upper Laguna Madre. It's about 6 miles south of the JFK Causeway. And this island is monitored by the Coastal Bend Bays and Estuaries program, and they have been noticing a lot of habitat loss over time. So the main problem facing or the triangle tree is facing is erosion due to wind-driven waves. So the figure on screen shows the relative shoreline location over the last 20 years or so. Now, typically, if you've spent any time in the Corpus area, you know our predominant wind directions are out of the southeast. However, there's a pretty limited fetch to the south of the island, so that southern shoreline has stayed relatively stable. However, on the north side of the island, it's open to that 6 miles of bay. So whenever we get the winter cold fronts, which generally produce some of our stronger wind speeds throughout the year, the northern shoreline gets fully impacted. And over those 20 years, it's seen about 55 feet of shoreline retreat, which is about 3 feet per year, and then a total loss of about a little over half an acre, which for an island of this size is a relatively large amount. So before getting into our design, we go through our site characterizations and regulatory surveys to see for any submerged aquatic habitat. And that kind of leads to one of the first hurdles that we have to get through with projects around these types of rookery islands, especially in this area of the Texas coast. There's a lot of seagrass in the water around them. So the figure on screen shows the results of our seagrass survey. You can see outside of the channels to the north and south of the island and directly adjacent the shoreline, pretty much the entire survey area was covered in seagrass, which is shown by the green, and then what we were calling patchy seagrass, which is the tan color. Some of the other things we have to take into consideration throughout all Texas bays are any oil and gas infrastructure buried underneath, and then just from a constructability standpoint for these projects, these rookery islands typically have pretty shallow bathymetry around them, which makes accessing them a bit tough. So getting into our protection design, we designed a breakwater to go around the island, and the main consideration was reducing any impacts to the seagrass that we see around the island. And you can tell by at least on the northern side of the island, where the breakwater really has to hug right along the shoreline. And then going through our regulatory process, we had to come up with a access corridor so the contractor could actually get to the site. So we plan to use the Southern Relic Channel, which would lead them straight to that the lower eastern side of the breakwater. And we planned this out to where the contractor would almost use the breakwater as a road to start on the eastern side, and as they're progressing along, just use their machinery on top of the breakwater to start from the east side and move all the way around to the west. And if you look at our cross sections, for those who have seen something like that before, generally this would be a larger breakwater than we would intend for, you know, the typical conditions we see in a Texas bay. But due to having heavy machinery drive over top, we had to give it a larger cross section with a pretty wide 10-foot crest width. Then a couple of the other considerations were on the north side. You can see there's a gap in between the breakwater that had to be put in place because there was a buried oil pipeline underneath there. So we didn't want to leave any rock on top of that for too long, but that also allows for water and fish passage to that northern area so it doesn't create just a stagnant pond. And then really just to kind of harp again on the construction methodology, this is typically not how contractors would like to build a breakwater. Generally, they would like to bring a barge right next to your breakwater with rock on it where they can move it directly from the barge into the template. However, due to the limitations that we're facing at this site with seagrass and the bathymetry, that wasn't possible. So you can see in the larger photo, that's kind of how they had to access the site. So this is facing from the Gulf Intercoastal towards Triangle Tree Island, where the contractor basically had to build a bridge through the access corridor with some barges, and that's where they would store their machinery, and then rock would have to be light loaded on smaller barges brought over there. And then once the rock is actually to their staging area, they had to use what are called Maruca buggies, which you can see in the top right, which is basically a dump truck on tracks. And then the top part of it spins around in 360 degrees, which is pretty cool to see, but offers a little bit more mobility for the contractor to move back and forth across the breakwater. However, as you can see in the photo, there's maybe a foot of space on either side of the track of the breakwater, or of the tracks of the Marucas. And then the Marucas themselves really carry a pretty small amount of rock, which then, as they're moving farther away from their staging areas, really increases the overall project time, and then along with that, the overall project costs. And then just one last thing to kind of really hit home on how shallow the bathymetry was around there. The picture on the bottom, bottom right, is from when the breakwater was completed, and that's taken over on the west side. Now, this was during a cold front, so there were extremely low water levels, but really that whole sandbar over there was completely dry, and that's another big issue that we've faced when building this breakwater, or the contractor faced, is actually getting their equipment out to site. And then through all the trials and tribulations, here's a pretty photo of our completed product. I have a couple of project specifics here, but to leave Rosario some time for her slides, I'll hand it over to you and be more than happy to answer any questions later.
Thanks, Matt. Okay, so now I'll be talking about some three upcoming Rookery Island construction projects that the estuary program is working on. So we've already gone through the preliminary engineering design and permitting, so we're in the final design phase, and we hope to start construction on these projects in the summer and fall. And HDR is the project engineer for these projects. So just a brief overview, Dead Man Island is the first one I'll be talking about. This is in Aransas Bay. The project goal is to enhance and restore the colonial waterbird habitat on Dead Man Island and the oyster reef habitat adjacent to the island to protect the island from erosion and relative sea level rise. So historically, this island was part of Long Reef, and so now the Dead Man Island is only 0.7 acre in size and has not been an active rookery island the past few nesting seasons. It's a very dynamic island, so birds haven't been using it. Factors contributing to the erosion of the island are the wind-driven waves, wave action from ships traveling the nearby GIWW, and the sea level rise. There are actually few rookery island options for colonial water birds within Aransas Bay. So this is the project layout. We plan to construct a breakwater completely around the island. It's a 1,700 linear foot breakwater. We're also putting in fill, 2 acres of fill material to expand the island. And then we're also including a 0.9 acre oyster reef feature. So we're hoping construction can start in the summer of 2025. Our funding partners for this is the NOAA, GLO, and the EPA. The next project is Turn Island, which is in the upper Laguna Madre. It's 0.3 miles north of the JFK Causeway. Like I said, we've done the feasibility and alternative analysis. We've gone through permitting. So we have the construction funds. The GLO is a partner on this as well. We're receiving KEPRA and GOMESA funds. And the island, again, was formed with dredge placement from oil and gas exploration in the 60s and 70s, and it became an active rookery. It supports a lot of birds, ground nesters, and wading birds. So the design, again, is to have a rock breakwater 1,155 linear foot around the perimeter of the island. We do have one gap for beach access and maintenance. And we're also importing some fill material, which will be placed behind the breakwater to expand the island footprint and expand the nesting habitat. So the project status, we do have a permit in place. We are still waiting on our GLO surface lease. We do hope to construct in the fall of 2025. As part of the core permit, we are required to monitor. We do have some temporary seagrass impacts, which will be within the construction corridor. It's 0.06 acres, very tiny. But we will be monitoring. So we will have to do seagrass surveys prior to the construction, and then 90 days after the construction, and then yearly after that. And as part of this project, we're also doing a wetland creations. It's 0.33 acres of emergent wetland. We're planting that with native vegetation, including Spartina alterniflora. The final project I'll talk about is Benny Shack, which is in the lower Laguna Madre. It's 4.5 miles southeast of Port Mansfield in Willacy County. So it includes a North and South Island. So these islands were created during the dredging of the GIWW. The islands are relatively high in elevation relief on the north sides, but wave erosion has taken a significant toll. Relative sea level rise has also submerged the lower lying portions of the island. And so during the alternative analysis phase, this is the option that we agreed upon, which avoids the seagrass impacts. And so the wonky breakwater design is because we are trying to avoid the seagrass. So we submitted an individual permit to the Corps in January of 2024 and we received the permit in November of 2024. So it took 11 months. I heard someone else say 7 months for their permit, which is pretty good. So it's the construction of a 1,939 linear foot breakwater on that South Island. We're also bringing in some fill material northward of the island, and we do have a borrow source area nearby, so that's good. Again, we are hoping to do this construction in the fall of 2025, and our funding partners is the GLO Kepler funds. And we're just excited to start all these projects. Thank you very much. That's going to be from an outside source, up to the contractor. Thank you.
Thank you.